Yes, sorry. You disappeared. Hi, everybody. Very happy to be here. Everybody can hear me okay? Raise your thumb. I'm going to share my screen to get us started. So hopefully you see now two a black and white picture, and this is the Museum Gardens. Raise your thumbs if you can see my screen okay? All right, good. So very happy to be here. As Todd mentioned, I've been practicing for quite a long time. And when Todd invited me to sort of have a conversation in this sort of series that I understand is a bit more about dialogue, I thought about many different topics, but one that has always been in my mind for many years is how we as landscape architects, although we have a very sort of defined role in our profession, I find myself always sort of playing a lot of different roles in projects, and that's how I see her, and the group that I'm in right now sees as the only way to really connect with communities, as Todd was saying, is one of the main focus that we have, and I've had throughout my career in the different firms that I worked on. So this image is basically just a couple of intro images, a little bit about my story of how I've worked and moved around the Bay Area in different opportunities to engage with different people. And then I'll present just three projects as quickly as possible to allow a little bit more time for conversation. But just as three examples of recent work in how we have been making changes of how we actually work and how we practice, and maybe that would trigger some conversation. This project here, the Dion Museum, funny enough, was when I first started working right out of school. I had practiced as an architect in my home country of Mexico, but when I came to Berkeley to study landscape architecture, I had to kind of flip my mentality. And I joined Hood Design Studio, which is where I am now. And so that's where I really started my career. I was there for a couple of years, and I got the chance to work on this project that really changed the way I started looking at design. And I felt it was a great opportunity to grow in that. After Hood Design, I actually joined EDO, that became eventually AECOM, and I stayed there for 10 years. And in that practice, I had a lot of opportunity, as Todd mentioned, to travel all over the world. We did have a lot of different projects in very many different scales. But some of my favorite projects are the ones in which we got a chance to sort of create big thinking, as in sort of master plans, and then put it in practice in typically one project. So these four examples here from the LMU library, the Student Center in Georgia Tech, the LA waterfront, and this project in Mexico started as this sort of larger thinking and trying to influence our clients on how to go about making changes in their environments. But then we were put to the test. And this is why I love landscape, because in a way, you have to plant it on the ground and make it grow. And that is how you say these big picture ideas have to be meaningful. Since I joined back Hood Design after sort of being in this adventure around the world for 10 years, it's been an interesting last 3 years, because in a way is reconnecting to how I started in the profession. But one of the distinctions in what Walter Hood, if you know of him, is the sort of owner of the company and the main principal. One of the things that he does in this practice, which is one of the reasons why I felt interested in coming back, is that there is a lot of blurring of boundaries in the way that we practice. And there is not such a thing as so many distinctions between architecture and landscape and even public art. So if you see some of these examples of projects, they have very strong agendas of what we all care about these days. There is a lot of sort of environmental concerns, from like reclaiming some older trees that were about to be destroyed, and we use them in a project in LA, to basically this whole park in Buffalo that is all about this sort of panel of PV, array of PV panels. So a small garden here in Queens where it's a community garden that includes actually rain capture element that feeds the water into the gardens. And then even this closer to home, Splash Pad Park, in which what used to be just a sort of right-hand turn street, we turn it into a series of rain gardens within this open space. But one of the things that you can notice in commonality here is that a lot of the things that we do in implementing landscape architecture in our practice is that there's a lot of sculpture or a lot of kind of more architectural elements included. And for us, that is because we call ourselves a cultural practice. And by that, we mean that we strategically and strongly try to connect with the people that we are working with and try to create iconography, try to create elements that would feel familiar. So there's this whole interest in the practice about creating things that is based on people's way of life. So you would recognize something that feels familiar or even so somewhat whimsical that informs that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of how do we make change, how we change in the world, and how do we change our own practice to respond to the ever-changing, crazy world we live in, has been a sort of always a revolving question in my head, and I would like to have a chance to talk to you about this today. So the first example is a project that I'm currently working on as sort of the lead designer, and that is People's Park. And this brings back one aspect of what we do in all of our projects, and that is we are primarily storytellers. We try to find ways to connect with our communities, to create design based on stories, based on things that people tell us that people want to see. And in this instance, if you're familiar with People's Park, this is a very storied site, very controversial project. So when I'm talking about creating stories, it's not always happy times and everybody's loving the effect. Sometimes our job in the projects is to really find and sort of tackle the difficult questions to be able to move forward. For those of you who may not be familiar, People's Park has been as a park that was created in kind of an impromptu response during the 1969 movement of sort of free speech in the University of Berkeley, and they basically took over the space that was a property or is property of the university and turned it into a park. Currently, because of a lot of different factors, but primarily this crazy homelessness crisis that we have in the state and in our city, the university has been charged to increase the number of housing units it has for students tremendously. And one of the properties that they are considering for development of more student housing is People's Park. As you can imagine, when that became public, it was not a happily received idea. We got engaged in this project and we understood, as landscape architects, the instinct is like, we want to create open space, we want to preserve open space, we want to make parks. But in this instance, we were invited to participate to figure out how we can balance two very difficult questions. That is, one is of like the housing crisis that we do have, and how the university has caused some of that problem in a way by having so many students. And on the other hand, a very important cultural resource of our communities, which is People's Park. So the way that we engaged in this project was literally trying to understand how to tell a story, how to build a story that would allow for at least a conversation with different parties involved. And so in a way here, our initial job was not to begin to sort of plant trees and do landscape design in and of itself, but really sort of figure out how to come back to a conversation, a point of conversation with all the different people that was not very happy with the idea of building anything on the park. So after a lot of different meetings we had, one of the three messages that we extracted from there was that most importantly, people wanted the university to be able to tell the right story and not to control the story as they were perceiving it. So in this instance, what we did is we spent quite a bit of time trying to understand what's the story of this park? How does this became? Because we all know what this park is about, but not everybody quite understands the story. So we actually used this timeline to create a more robust idea of how this site used to be a part of the community, became a park as sort of community action, and has become a symbol of counterculture for many years, but it has also attracted some social problems that need to be recognized. So literally in this project, we were creating what we call the sort of three big stories. It's like what the park or the site used to be before was a city block with actual houses in there. That led us to think about ways, if you just focus on that part of the history of the park, what kind of project would you build? And so we did a lot of these sort of very quick, sort of inviting sketches for that reason. We then did a lot of thinking about what if you just focus on the era of this park. And the park currently is 2.8 acres of land. So what does that 2.8 story can suggest? And we sketch a lot of things in design. And these are all tools for communicating with people instead of just trying to strike a conversation. What if we were to make this place super playful, push the buildings to one end, etc. And the third story that came from that third era of like what is happening today, which is positive and negative because there's some aspects of what has happened in the park since 1969 that are pretty positive, but some of the ones are not as positive or more challenging for some groups in the community. So if you think about just the current site, is more about this sort of central kind of open space, and then there's a grove of trees and a bunch of gardens that have evolved over the years. So again, we tested that as a tool to think about how we would create a space. And then we got really brainiac about how then each of the stories could become a way to organize different factors of any project, from urban connections to access to sort of more pragmatic elements of the project. What we ended up with, and this is what has been presented back to the community, and we've had less aggressive reactions, I guess, and it's still in progress, honestly, but it's a hybrid. And one of the biggest, I think, accomplishments that we as the Landscape Architects Group can claim is the fact that we were able to convince the university to really open up the space and to not be afraid to let it be public the way it used to be, while maintaining the security that is required for what they need to provide in a student housing. So the main premise of this project right now is that even though there's a humongous program on it for student housing, as opposed to many of the other student housing units that have on campus, this one on every edge, the idea is that you will feel invited as a public space and that all the edges are a little blurred and you can go even through the site and still be able to have some of the historic and programs that we had on the site before. So I'm gonna speed up this thing, but as you see, the idea is that as you move around the site, there are moments in which you could forget that there's more buildings on site, and then the scale of the open space that we were able to convince the university to maintain is what makes this project a little bit more accessible. In addition, then this is to the university's credit, there is a whole component of what is called sort of community housing for some of the people that are formerly unhoused. But one of the responsibilities that we had is not only to do that, but in the storytelling, and this is why we were able to maintain communication with the different groups, is that we were weaving some of the concerns that they had. So preserving some of the trees, allowing for circulation to be free throughout the project. So for example, this edge over here remaining open is one of the areas that we considered. And at the same time, be able to respond to this, to the university to say, you can provide perfect security for the students in sort of like an envelope, but then have a second set of sort of divisions, I guess, that feel natural on the side, but that will allow you to control some of the areas. And then there's a third layer of security, if you may, in which the way that the site is organized suggests some areas that are more public than others, but in a way that allows the sort of all the users to come together. And that is one of the main things that we wanted to sort of bring home, and that we were able to talk to with everybody, that this is a project that is not only for the students that will live here, but that will still can allow for all members of the community to participate on the site without affecting each other in a negative manner. And so the conclusion is that we are really able to form a governance body with the university that will allow other voices to remain involved and to create elements that are even for commemoration of some of the events that took place on the site. I'm going to speed it up now, but The second example is another example of how we have transformed a little bit, or how I have transformed the way I worked a little bit. This is a project that we were invited by the university, Princeton University in New Jersey, and it was to create a marker for, originally that was the name of the project, Woodrow Wilson's marker. Woodrow Wilson, as you know, very controversial character in our history, and Princeton was president of Princeton. So there are many things in Princeton that were called Woodrow Wilson. So at some point in history, a few years ago, a group of students of color got together and demanded the university to remove all mentions of Woodrow Wilson in the university. The sort of empowered bodies at the university decided that they did not want to get rid of the name, but instead they wanted to commission a piece that would allow to deal with his complex legacy. So we competed on this project and won the competition to implement this piece. And this was literally about trying to figure out how a character such as Woodrow Wilson, which was in some aspects positive in our history, but also a racist individual who actually changed for the negative many things in the US. And so what we worked to develop was to create a piece where sort of there was two sides to the story that were to be told. And we tested all of that as a way to figure out how we can incorporate many messages that can be read. So this piece, even though it's an art piece, it's a sculpture in many senses, would be a spatial component that would be able to tell stories. And so that had to be connected to the campus. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Princeton, it's a very sort of green campus. There's a lot of very historic and traditional buildings. And so there was a lot of concerns to be taken into account of how it fits on the site. And so that's kind of the landscape part of the project, how you see it from different angles, how it connects or disconnects and highlights different aspects of the site. We chose a location in this plaza, and the piece simply talking about the sort of double sites. What's a play on Du Bois's explanation of the sort of double consciousness of this idea of being having to struggle to deal with a dual personality in a world where we should all be received as the same. And in this project, again, we did a lot of what would be a normal sort of site design component to it, of how everything fits on the site. But more importantly, we were charged with trying to tell the story of this individual in a way that we wouldn't try to celebrate his negative aspects, but also consider all of them. We actually ran a number of meetings with different people in the university that were interested in this project, and ended up even curating some of all of the words that are included on the sculpture. And what ended up happening is that we created an element that it has some spatial component, but all the exterior are quotes of Wilson, some very good and some horribly bad. And then in the inside, there will be comments from his contemporaries, and most of the quotes inside were actually quite critical of him. And that was one way to explain that many folks say, well, yeah, he's a racist, but he was a man of his time. And what we were trying to do with this piece is to represent that even people of his time considered him a racist, and therefore not necessarily a justification for some of the things that he did or said. So we actually included a lot of the words from his contemporaries that were critical of him. We created a lenticular screen in the inside where a lot of those contemporaries were illustrated, but in a manner that you can kind of see them come and go. And the main goal was, this is the piece completed, is that we were trying to create a space for people to have a dialogue, for people to come read his words on the outside that are just all written without rhyme or reason. They're just put it in a kind of a stream of consciousness type of way, but in the inside, be invited to see yourself reflected and understand the words that were critical back then that maybe potentially apply to certain precedents that we have currently in power. So we had a lot of reactions to this piece, and it's been quite interesting to kind of see how this has evolved. During the opening of when the piece was completed, there
When did it open,
were
Alma? When did it open?
Last summer.
Uh-huh.
So we had, so here's double sides as the sort of lenticular. I mean, I'm rushing through this just because I'm running out of time. But this was
No, it's okay. You've got about 10, 15 minutes. I know you have one other project, so
okay.
We end around 12:45. That's fine.
Okay, cool. So this was the day that was the opening, and what happened, which for us as the designers and the way that we had created the space was a happy occurrence, even though it was a little part of this thinking of how sometimes, even as the storytellers, we get misinterpreted or misunderstood. So this was a group of many of the organized groups of students of color. They got together during the opening and they formed a protest. And they were basically complaining about their perception that this was another one sculpture to Woodrow Wilson in campus. There was a very small explanation on the piece, and there was a whole website. But just hearing how people immediately got attracted to the piece to start talking again and bringing up some of these comments was actually part of what we wanted to do with this piece. So we were satisfied with that. What happened after that, interestingly enough, is that because of all the sad protest, I mean, the sad incurred because of George Floyd's death recently, and all the additional, protests that ensued, this group of students reorganized themselves again and went back to the university to request again that the Woodrow Wilson name is removed from the university. And talking about how we are able to change the world, this is a quote that came from our client saying that they actually are removing the name. And one of the contributors to this is the fact that one of the people that was much more stuck in like, we have to maintain the name of this guy in our university, read the quotes that we put on the piece. And by reading those quotes, she changed her mind and suddenly became an advocate for getting rid of his name. So we felt that was kind of the goal at the end of the day of doing something like that. So this is how it is a sculpture in many descriptions, but it's such a spatial and an influential piece that we feel that is part of what we do as practitioners. The last example I wanted to show is because this has been in talking about the multiple roles and how we can influence communities and how we can contribute to communities. This is a very unique example. We were hired and this is a project in Milwaukee, and it's called the Beer Line. It's a former railroad, the sort of distributing ring that used to exist in Milwaukee when there were beer factories everywhere. There's still a lot of bigger beer factories, I think, but the ones that used to be along this corridor are now no longer beer factories. But this was called the Beer Line for that reason. A few years ago, the city got together, they removed the tracks from a big segment of this area, and they transformed half of it into a greenway. But the second half, which is this phase that we're talking about, you see on the image on the right, was left as just sort of the tracks removed and just some lawn. What happens here is that the communities that inhabit those two sides of the beer line are quite different. So Walter had been invited initially to come to a community event that took place here. And this is the beer line phase 2 area, already improved, quote unquote. They removed the tracks, they put this sort of asphalt line, and that was it. But this area is surrounded by these humongous factories. So even though that trail had been placed in, the community had gone together under the with the help of an organization called Riverworks to try to add a little bit more layers of the site. And Walter had been invited to participate in one of their those community events as just somebody to speak and sort of talk about and participate. Based on that, we got invited to come back and think about how else can this segment of the beer line can become more integrated with the community, more inviting to the community, So we launched kind of like a second exercise in which we focus on this part of the site and try to figure out how can we facilitate more connections. And there were 4 topics that people were very interested in, sort of food, art, connectivity, and play. And so, yeah, play. So we started actually a lot of engagement events in which we were just initially collecting information. And what we ended up discovering is that what this part needed to be is just not a phase 2 of the beer line, but it had to be Harambe's beer line, which is the other neighborhood right next to the one that created the first phase. And Harambe is a primarily African-American community that basically fought to change its name to become Harambe. And so they have a lot of these interesting layers of its legacy and how that then begins to translate into the site. You can kind of see here how this blue line represents the beer line. So the number 1 is where the phase 1 was developed. It's primarily in this neighborhood called River West, which includes a lot of the more sort of wealthier sort of housing, but it is surrounded primarily by residential. As you get to what we're doing ourselves, which is the phase 2, you can see the industrial footprints coming here and this Harambe community then having a very different character. So we engage again with, and so try to understand how the community is different and the same at the same time. What are the positives, the negatives? There's all these beautiful houses that actually are on the residential side, even in that industrial in Harambe, and they're near the industrial, like right across the street from this picture, is a humongous industrial lot. So we created what we call a life ways plan. And life ways is because it basically means that we're trying to build on what people are already doing in their own life and not sort of come up with necessarily alien ideas. And we built it all around this idea of what we're calling the landscapes of hope. And this is because there was a lot of resistance to add any program in that area because people perceived it as dangerous because there was not a lot of openings because you have this sort of larger building footprints. And so we were sort of challenging in our conversations with people and understanding what they were telling us. We felt that there was this desire to go more extraordinary, less safe and more risky, more atypical, and sort of focus on things that will encourage investment and not something that eventually will get destroyed. So with that, we developed a very, very long and complex project that built on this idea of quilting. It became an opportunity for us to do many things. So this is the overall plan with the interventions. But knowing how this community was able to move forward with this project, we also divided into initial projects, divided into, even within that phase 1, for example, we divided into these different steps in order to give them a way to fund it as different elements that will work together if they get implemented over time. So this was, in essence, a landscape architecture project in which everything is a puzzle and every piece will actually come over time. And we work with them in the document to really even present it that way for them to pick and choose. Like today, I'm gonna be able to do this piece, or we got a donor to do this element, and we're gonna be able to add it up over time without affecting its performance in the end. There were 2 other sort of segments, so we did the same thing for each one of the 2 segments. And then we even went further. We had a lot of conversations with people about wanting to take advantage of the industrial heritage of Milwaukee and see how some of those materials can be incorporated in an artistic and magical way. So we created what we call a pattern book, in which we were explaining each of the recycled materials. If you get pieces of concrete, what do you do with them? Where do you put them? How do you implement them? These are the patterns that you can create. So if you get a lot of these many pieces, go ahead and do this piece over here, and over time, everything will add up. We did a similar series of strategies with even more of the sort of industrial elements that are found just around our site, and devise some strategies for them to even implement that. And then created some specific, there's a lot of language on this document later, out of all like this sort of strategies about how do you go into create what we call a recycled material park over time that adds up to something interesting. And then we added a layer of how can those elements become more artful or even sort of tell the story of the community? So we had this idea about even a mural program as part of it. We gave them some thoughts about programming that they have already. And then we gave them a very, very detailed cost estimate that had, again, all the pieces broken down into tiny pieces so they can pick and choose as they get donors or as they get funding collected, done. And what happened, ironically, is that Hood Design obtained a Knight Foundation grant last year. And that grant basically is to fund other projects or to help communities with community building projects. So we, Hood Design, took some of that funding, and because this project had everything sort of slided down into pieces, well, not we, but the Knight Foundation has donated some of that funding to create 2 pieces that were part of that plan that were these murals. So we're literally currently, not only as sort of the planners, now we're coming back to be the funders and help them implement this project. So that's it. Those are the 3 examples. And the question sort of to me is that sort of circle of, as a landscape architect, I'm confronted daily with a lot of different challenges in how to do landscape architecture. But at the same time, that basically comes with me having to adapt to respond to many other tasks and develop other skills, I guess, or team up with others to create these other programs that feed our projects. So the ability to be able to plant a good planting scheme is actually just a very tiny sliver of what I feel we all do on a daily basis. So this notion that we're constantly adapting, transforming, enhancing, and providing ideas of how people can care for the spaces that we recommend, to me is what makes us the profession that we are. So when we started this whole thing, Todd had asked me if I had any thoughts about, for example, this sort of now how we are adapting as a profession in this shelter in place. And my thought was initially, well, we're constantly adapting as a profession all the time. So it hasn't been that hard in some instances to say we'll continue to adapt. There's new conditions and this new world that we're going to go out to when we go out to it will only require us to continue to adapt and transform. So I'll stop there and see if we can have a bit of a conversation.
Okay, that's great. Thanks so much, Alma, for your presentation. I can certainly ask a few questions. I'm hoping a few more come into the Zoom chat, but I think from what I saw, it just shows that there's a lot of balance. Your presentation is titled The Multiple Hats. So there's multiple hats of certainly on the design side from landscape architecture and sculpture and art. But there's also a lot of balance on community, politics, engagement, and rooting your projects in its context. Maybe one of the first questions would be, I don't think any of those were during COVID, but how do you and how does your team work on projects in the current state right now of working kind of from home and really haphazard kind of site visits? And how do you engage community in your projects?
So I think a little bit what I was saying on the last slide, because we always have to adapt, and we are the kind of profession that every site is actually different. Even if we think it's the same, or if it's in the same region, every particular site is so different that we're constantly trying to reinvent a little bit, at least this is how we feel about it, trying to reinvent how we connect with communities. So the standard, we're just gonna have a meeting and everybody will be happy, we're gonna come to an agreement and move on, actually has never happened. So the more we develop projects and actually I would say it's because of modern technology, not just because of COVID. For example, for the beer line in Milwaukee, one of the first times we started using, like literally I brought a bunch of Google viewers to put a little movie that we created and share with the community, because that idea of the landscapes of hope had come from many discussions from a lot of people saying, we want to see a lot of green here and we want to see more activities every day, etc. And then other group of people in the same community saying, that's never going to happen. It's impossible. It's super scary. That site is never been used. it will never be used. And so ironically, one of the main points of contention was how many trees we're going to put on site. Because trees in this context were seen as you're going to create more barriers, visual barriers, and therefore it's going to be even scarier. And we were proposing as a starting point, let's put a lot of trees in there. So we ended up with these viewers where we put the trees and everything on the thing so they can literally walk the site with it. Because for many, many words I could say, they could not believe me. Trees are not scary. No, they are, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened with that is that since we went to COVID, we haven't been able to go back to the site. But now we send them these little videos of things that they kind of, because we tested it with them together, now they use it. I'm like, send us the updated video if you put it here, now that we're doing the murals. So now I can walk and see it. Okay, I get it. So it's interesting because it did start, 2 years ago, and we were there as much as we could. But nowadays we're implementing some of that. So it's similar with People's Park. We did start it out of COVID. We had a couple of meetings, and then we were all put into seclusion. And so the last meeting has been virtual, but because we had already established somewhat of a communication, it was easy to continue that conversation.
That's great. Well, I don't know if you want to share your screen. There's two questions that are specifically about People's Park that I'd like to ask both, and I can reiterate them, but I want to make sure that I say both of them. So on People's Park, one of the questions is, the walkways seem quite wide. Is that truly necessary? Can you talk a little bit about the swale and rain garden? And then because of COVID-19, do you think there's additional housing going to be needed in that area? So that's one thing. You can start thinking about that. And then another one from Jacinta is, thanks so much for your work and your presentation, talking also about People's Park. As a refined and highly accomplished designer, how do you approach the tension between preserving highly unstructured but beloved democratic spaces and the desire to produce better outcomes for all in a beautiful space? In a way, this is a question about community perceptions of the trained design professionals' aesthetics and authenticity. So both around People's Parks, if you want to share your screen and show the plan to point to things, go for it. Otherwise, those are the two, and I'm happy to reiterate when you need.
Sure. I mean, what I share right now, it's actually what is being presented by the university. So all of it is public, and there's still a lot of community outreach and ways to participate to provide more input. So I would encourage everybody also to do that as well. I can tackle the second question first in terms of how do you address a controversial question as this one. If I understood the question correctly, is basically that's the crux of this project. As a landscape designer, when presented with the possibility that a beloved park, even though it has its kind of social tensions as it is today, was put on basically to be removed. That was the sort of the thing, the call on the street was, we're going to remove this park and put a building on it. This is, again, what is the role that we play? If we want to make our lives easier, we should have avoided that and go into be an activist and protest that intention and say, no, we should preserve the park. That's one approach. And actually internally as a team, we had a lot of conversation about that. What is the right thing to do here? What we decided to do as designers and as practitioners was to say, the university owns this land. They have the right to do, basically, if they want, they can remove the park and put a building. We felt that our role was, how can we make that process then be better to maintain what is the legacy of the park? And when I was presenting, some of the more vocal community members who were rightly so saying the university has been evil in so many ways, and has been, which I don't know if they've been evil, and that's what they were saying, that the university will take over a very good space and therefore they're acting in many ways as an evil sort of landowner. So we came and put ourselves into the fire, if that's the right word. And we tested how our approach to a project, which is to try to understand many voices. In this case, definitely there's a very strong voice of the people who participated, even personally, in some of the genesis of the park. They were there, some of them actually had the shovels who were creating this park. They have a very strong presence and they want to maintain the park for that reason. But there was also, that we learn as we talk to more people, there's a very strong newer generation of students even that have engaged with people in the park, and they are coming more from the point of view of like homelessness is a problem for that we all need to address, but the community that occupies the park today is part of our community, so you shouldn't kick it out. You shouldn't kick them out. So those were the two things. It was the people preserving a history or a memory, and the people who were trying to preserve a condition that they felt was solving to some degree a problem. But the university was saying, we are providing better housing for the local residents of the park, and we need to be responsible with our part to contribute to more housing to help the whole region. And so again, our role here was to fight for the park, but with a smart approach to convince the university. And this is what I was saying, it's a little hard to imagine how the project started with a much bigger building and a small open space in the center as a courtyard, with the idea that that's security for the students. So the main mindset from the university standpoint was, this is a place for students. Therefore, I need to create it secure. Through this whole process and engaging the community openly and having to bring up these other stories, this was a piece of the city before it was a park. This became a park and now has become a place for kind of services in a way. How do we marry them all? So the fact that we were able to convince different players to push the building and to maintain an open space at that scale, with the level of security that doesn't require a fence around the whole site, which is what you see in all the other housing projects in Berkeley, basically. That's what I think was the responsibility that we put ourselves to do, and that was the challenge. Now, did we get it right? Is it perfect? Definitely not. There's always the little voice in my head as a landscape architect saying, I hope it just stays a park. But if I don't act, I don't know if the university will respond that way. So at least I push the agenda that we all believe in while trying to listen to other voices. I don't know if that answers the question. I was trying to answer both questions at the same time. The specifics about the park, the width of the path and all those kinds of things, that's all still under evaluation. That path is wide because it's one of the gestures in terms of building that particular story of the 1969 march of the students. Basically, you know, a little bit of the story, they were in Sproul Plaza, they were basically kicked out and gassed out, and they basically ran into this open space that was not a park at the time. It was an empty lot. They destroyed a fence and walked through. So that big walk is one way to sort of begin to represent how they came from Telegraph Avenue and they went into the park. A lot of those details are to be refined. So that's what I was saying. There's still a website that is open. So if you have a recommendation, like make that wider or smaller or make more green, etc., that is there's still time to contribute.
What phase is the project in right now?
So we are about to kick off schematic design only. So this was done as a sort of concept design, and it began the community process.
That's great. Let's see. Many thank yous for the detail. Saban or Krista or anyone else? Questions for Alma? I certainly have more, but I want to open it up to other people.
I have questions for the audience. Just kidding.
Alma, I just typed up a question, but I'll just kind of reiterate it for you. So first off, thank you for your presentation. I resonate greatly with your work and your design process. So with your multidisciplinary design approach, considering all factors of community, site context, and sculpture. What continual challenge do you face, and how do you overcome that?
I think it's just like any. I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly, but this is how I'm interpreting. There is an advantage of trying to be super multifaceted in our practice. And I don't think that is unique to hood design per se. Is the sort of where I am, it is a little bit more openly expressed, and we're constantly saying that we blur the boundaries. But I think all landscape architects have to do that a little bit. The challenges are that the more you broaden all the things that you want to learn to do, obviously, sometimes the challenge is like multitasking. Sometimes there's no tasking at all in my mind. And I have learned over the years that I am a horrible multitasker. Everybody says that that's the thing that we do, but that's a lie. We all sort of just be able to do one thing at a time. So there's a certain a challenge in that respect, that sometimes I feel we do need to focus on certain things and not try to absorb everything. There are a lot of projects in which we get invited to play a couple, literally 2 hats. So you can do the landscape architecture and also sort of think about public art. And we've done that successfully in some projects more than in others, particularly in projects that are more cultural. We're doing the International African American Museum in Charleston, and that one is one where landscape and sculpture is almost the same, and that's is one that lends itself very much to do that. Other projects that is a little bit more challenging to do. So having to say no sometimes, okay, we do everything that we want and we blur all the boundaries, but sometimes I find myself talking to the principals in the office to like, let's set up some boundaries. You stay here and I'll take care of this, and we'll divide and conquer, because you can't really be master of all trades.
And
I don't know if that was the question.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that kind of answered it. I guess there's a follow-up question here, but because you also do sculpture and you integrate a lot of public art, would you also call yourself or consider yourself like a design build, or how much does your work involve actually creating the artwork itself?
Yeah, a ton. I mean, when it comes to the implementation of projects, we do actually have a very discernible sort of bifurcation. I tend to help a lot with the art implementation projects, and I mostly run some of them because implementing is a design build, and the clients, they do the opposite of what they do in all of our A&E projects, in which you have a budget. The contractor is responsible for that, and we just, we have to VE our projects. That's the worst we can do in terms of managing our finances. But in the art projects, the client definitely give you, this is the money, go for it, make it happen, and you have to deliver a piece at the end of the day. So in some instances, depending on the agency that is the one running that. So we have projects right now on the East Coast. We have a couple in California. We do have to behave almost as a contractor. And so there, the thing is finding the right partner. So we have developed, and Walter's practice has been doing this for a long time. We have a fabrication lab in our studio, but we also have developed a lot of very good relationships with actual fabricators. And so as we're developing the projects for art implementation, instead of focusing a lot in creating super detailed CDs, which we do to a certain degree because I'm anal retentive and I have to do it that way, but also you really rely much more on the fabricator to provide input very early on. So even as we're developing the initial concept, you have to know how it's going to get built. You have to know how, what materials you're going to be using, what are the flexibilities, and anticipate code and, limitations by each municipality and all of that. So I think my formation over the years that I have trained as a landscape architect, in which I did not have to be responsible for that directly, because most of the projects that we did in my previous firms were not design built. But all that training has built up to help me be able to run some of these projects with the help of the right partners. That's always the secret, I think.
Awesome, thank you.
Alma, we were interested in what your question is back to the audience for us.
I was just curious if about the question that came up about what is one to do when you have a controversial project posed in front of you. So the two first projects I put in front of it because they were controversial. They were projects that people in essence did not want. And I felt that our job was to try to figure out how to make everybody happy, which is a bit of a crazy thing to aspire to do. But I was just, I don't know if people have any other experiences in that regard, or, you know, again, there is the philosophy of if you don't agree with the project, you just simply don't go after it and don't worry about it, but then somebody else will do it. And so maybe I don't trust others and I just want to be able to try myself, I guess. So I was curious about people's reactions to that more general question. Philosophical question.
Well, we just hit 1 o'clock exactly. I can't thank you enough on behalf of the chapter. This has been a really great hour. Thank you everyone for sharing their lunchtime with us. Next month, in the middle of September, we're going to have Rosa Sheng, who is the Justice, Equity, and Diversity and Inclusion leader at Smith Group, and we'll be talking about that, which aligns with the chapter's new announcement on that. So thank you again for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Alma. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, bye.
Bye.